Okay, so Yuko Edwards is an American artist born in Iowa and raised all around the United States, from South Dakota to California and Oregon. She attended Hampshire College in Massachusetts and graduated with degrees in sociology and film. Her work addresses concepts of self and social identity. Notions of space and place are often present. She's shown work at Spring Street Gallery, Saratoga Springs, New York, and more recently at the Center for Fine Art Photography in Colorado. You can see recent photography work in the RWA Open exhibition, which is currently online and opens in person in January. She's a recipient of a New York Foundation of the Arts Artist Grant in video, and her film Politics from a Black Woman's Insides had screenings at the Brooklyn Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and at festivals around the world. So Yuko, over to you.
Oh, thank you. So can everybody hear me? Because I'm, yeah. Great. So if you can I share the screen? Oh, hold on one second. All right. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm basically, just gonna sort of talk about ideas for a bit. Things that were happening during the pandemic period, which we're still in, even though there's a vaccine supposedly that's arrived today. But basically, I want to talk about a lot of sort of unresolved issues. Like many of you guys, I think we've all spent many, many months at home. And I know I have with just my close family members. So, you'd think that with all the isolated time that we've had, would have had time to just sit down and relax or think. But I think for me anyway, with the mess that was sort of happening in the world, my thoughts were very much focused on social disparities, the protesting, the suffering and the violence and the death. All that in isolation was a bit much. Anyway, so I found my need to sort of express myself slightly different than usual. But I sort of tapped into some personal histories and experiences that I hope you'll see that they speak to maybe a wider societal mood. So let's see how this goes. I just want to say, before the pandemic, I was already working on a documentary about sort of a small crematorium in a rural town in Oregon where I went to high school. My father, I moved to Britain in 2017. And a couple of years later, my father was talking about retiring. And so I knew he had this business that I hadn't sort of explored in the way that I thought should be explored. And this is a couple years earlier than where we are now. So I'm going to show some of that work in the talk today. But basically, I want to start here in Sacramento. So this is a photograph that I found during lockdown of a place that my parents bought when I was a child. I think we moved in when I was about 3 or 4 years old. And, when you buy a house, you don't know who you're living by, per se. So we moved in here and we found out that the neighbors in this house to the left didn't like the fact that we were Black. So, they pretended like we were invisible, which I think takes a certain type of energy. But what was interesting about this memory is that they had a dog, and on the fence, there was a big "Beware of Dog" sign. And so every time my brothers and I would go out to the backyard, there would be this dog running, with the adjacent fence, the mutual fence there, and just barking the whole time. And so, my 5-year-old brain, 6-year-old brain thought, okay, the neighbors don't like us. They're racist. So the dog doesn't like us either, apparently. And, you put those two things together. So I became very afraid of dogs, right? Later on, the interesting part of this is that we lived here for 7 years. And, at some point, they decided that they didn't want to see us in the front yard. So they cut down a nice little walnut tree and made a large fence. And I like these pictures because you can see sort of how these things happen one after another. So basically this was a period that, I became aware of the place where I lived, the neighborhood, but also the society. It was a society where it was very hard to avoid racism. And I'm going to tell you what I like about these pictures. What I like about these pictures is that they're a document. And I think it's interesting that whoever took them, I think my father, sort of went through systematically and documented what was going on. And I see it as sort of like, what we see today with how people are using their cell phones to document injustice. Earlier time, this was done with photographs. And here, what I love about it is that the date and the days are marked. Right? So anyway, what I think is that I learned really early on that the body sort of holds on to so much. And we have to deal with these sort of petty injustices, right? And I found these pictures of the three, we were three at that point sleeping. And it reminds me of sort of, how we sort of not only compartmentalize pain, but bury it. And these pictures hold sort of the stillness that I think that we don't see so often. So early on in lockdown, I was pretty much combing the web for what I saw as being pictures that had, countered the narrative that we were seeing in the media. And I found a lot of children sleeping, which I think is usual as a parent. We take pictures of our kids. But what I was really sort of fishing for was pictures of adults and, adults at rest. Because we really don't see that enough. Oh. There we go. I love this one. So during that whole time, at the beginning, it's hard to even go back to the beginning, but we knew so little about the virus and how it behaved. So, I became very aware of where I was living in Bristol. And I became very aware of who was coming and who was going from my property, coming to the door, just like that barking dog, basically. You know, I didn't know then as a child if the dog was going to jump the fence and bite me, or, you know, jump the fence and put me in the hospital, or, you know, kill me altogether. And I think it's very similar to how I was feeling about the virus at that time. We had no idea, you know, how it would affect us. And then we had, you know, politicians like Boris at the beginning, and of course Trump, who were pretending like it didn't exist. So, you know, I started making some pictures, and these are all sort of just works in progress. But I started making pictures, looking back at different properties that I had lived in, up to now. You know, Google is amazing. It can drop you back into your memories in an instant. And so I went to all these different sections of the country. I lived in Belgium when I was a teenager, for a year, and I started to sort of analyze these places. I also started to think about all the cardboard that was coming to my door, because the only person I was having contact with was the mailman, the delivery people. And so what I did was basically keep all the cardboard from that period and started using it as a material. So you can see this here is sort of a rendition of that house in Sacramento with the fence. So I started documenting basically everything that was coming in. This is sort of a little bit the life of an artist, right? And just sort of trying to figure out ways to sort of make art out of that and sort of mix it in with a little bit of my politics. You know, there was a need, I think, at the beginning, before the first lockdown, where we were all making protest signs, right? We had Extinction Rebellion. I traveled to London a few times for some anti-Trump rallies. And I think just before lockdown happened, we had Greta was here for, you know, the climate change large march. So I started making these little mini signs. They're quite small, because I wasn't really going out and protesting anymore. But I still wanted to sort of participate in some way. And they weren't meant really to be beautiful or creative, but almost more a reflection of the signs that I was seeing on the street. I almost did it almost like data entry in the sense. The images that I was seeing, I would just copy the slogans and then start paying attention to which slogans appeared more, to sort of get a collective sense of what people on the street were fighting for. There's this artist that I really like in Florida, Jason Lazarus. He did a virtual protest. He did a call out for people to join what he did, like a digital rendition of protesting, you know, mashing all faces with signs together for people with disabilities. I thought it was an amazing sort of collective of people, because what it made me think about, which I was thinking about a lot in lockdown, was what the numbers would look like. We were all looking at the crowds and thinking about how many people were out there, but what would the numbers look like if everybody had the ability, who had the ability to march, was marching. So I sort of really connected with that, because the entire time, we're really learning about and seeing how people were dying from the virus, right? And a lot of people, you know, their anger was bigger than their fear of the virus. So I was looking at the crowds in that same way. You know, we've not had to really negotiate that before. This idea of negotiating fear of death, you know, versus you know, protesting, you know, or fear of death versus loneliness. You know, we were negotiating a lot of things that we hadn't. And I found that quite interesting, you know, the fear of losing a loved one, for example, was in a way something new. These are some of the signs that I saw most in the street. I mean, I would love to do some sort of bigger study in that sense, but the UK is not innocent, say their names, no justice, no peace. And then I saw this, and I found this, sort of stopped me in my tracks, because it wasn't something that I had thought about to that point. I thought about losing a loved one, definitely. But I hadn't really imagined the fear of losing a loved one and then losing the remains of a loved one. So all of a sudden I was thinking about all the boxes that I was saving and all the things that, you know, were coming to our door, moral staples, you know, thinking of those things as food and medicine and the things that really sustain life. And then all of a sudden the idea of, you know, ashes of a relative or someone dear to us being lost. So during the pandemic, cremation has skyrocketed, especially in America, because cremation is quite common in Britain. But with funeral rituals and things, you know, changing because of restrictions, cremation has become one of the foremost ways of that people are you know, caring for their loved ones who've died. And all that's happening by shipping, obviously shipping ashes, you know, across countries and across continents. So I was thinking a lot about this, and which led me to sort of meditate on cremated remains and, you know, do a little bit of research on how that works. You know, we talk about immigration all the time and crossing borders in these ways, but I was quite fixated on the fact that, you know, I read stories where the husband had died and he had in his possession the ashes of his mother, and he now wanted to send them to, you know, the wife now wanted to send them to Australia, for example. So we're talking about large distances of travel. So I started making these stickers. And this is just a couple of them, but it was sort of like a way to keep my hands busy and my mind busy, thinking about of the people who were dying. And then I was sort of sustained by the protesters and how the protesters were staying out for so long, especially in places like New York and Portland and in other countries around the world. But what it reminded me of was really, especially after the murder of George Floyd, and the things that were coming out, regarding Breonna Taylor, the murder in her home, and the long list of Black people who've been murdered by police, that, the solidarity that we were seeing in the streets was altogether different than we had seen before. And I began to see it more like a public mourning, I guess, in a way that you see a funeral procession. And, in a sense, I was thinking, the whole sort of concept of saying Black Lives Matter is, in the statement itself, is acknowledging our grief. And so, to me, the protesters were, and I was reading accounts of people who had been out there for 100 days, every day for 100 days or more. They had, decided that the thing that they were fighting for was bigger than themselves. So that became really interesting. And it also was more recognition, I think, in terms of the virus for me, looking at the virus and seeing that, statistically, people of color were, more affected by the virus, and particularly in terms of death rate. So, I think it's not because we're of color per se, but it's because of our marginalization in society, right? So hypertension, obesity, diabetes, these things are directly related to quality of life issues. And I think that that's something that I try to analyze in my practice. That was a big thing. This is also what brought me to sort of review the film that I was making. And I had really big plans to make a full-length documentary, but over this period, I realized that how interesting it would be to make a short that sort of brought together a lot of the issues that in the division, what we were seeing were divisions, and what I wanted to sort of put together was something that made it more clear that we were all sort of a giant mass of humanity, so to speak. And here again is this cardboard box. Can you guys hear that? So a lot of what I shot a year ago or more was looking at the mechanics of death, I would say, maybe a little bit of the business of death, but also the mechanics of death, and looking at the women who work at the crematorium with my father, their reasons for doing this type of work, and also their knowledge in terms of the body and the breakdown of the body. So I'm going to show you one more. I'm going to show another short clip, just to say there's human bones in this one.
People believe and they're attached to this physical part of being human. The most important thing about us is not our body, but our consciousness, which is a part of the universal consciousness.
He's worked it out. Sheesh.
Some bones hold their shape, but most of them don't. Like the vertebrae, you can only see the vertebrae in it, and parts of the skull and the hip bones. But most everything falls apart. It's actually one of the ways we can tell if stuff is metal. Is when we pick it up like this, it feels heavier because the bones are so light. Whatever clothes they were wearing that have metal buttons doesn't look like they had feelings. Just had to run a magnet over it to make sure.
It's pretty good there. All organic. Gonna grind it up. Just a few seconds.
Right, so these are the women. I guess what's happened for me is that I've made a 10-minute short during the pandemic, and I think it's because the sort of plethora of death that we've been seeing, I think it should help us realize that we're sort of all in this life together. I made a film last year of a Black British man, and he was standing, in front of his own house, and he said, we're here and we're not going anywhere. And I think it's sort of this idea that, we got to get used to living with each other. And so I think what I've created is something that shows that, the end for all of us is the same. And that was something that all that thinking during quarantine made really important for me as a message. So I'd like to talk to everybody and see what people think about some of the ideas. I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you, Yuko. That was really interesting. I will open it out when you stop sharing to questions. I just had an observation myself, which is about that last segment of the film, and about how, you know, through that we're sort of privy to a world or an environment and a process that we don't usually have access to. And, you know, personally, I'm always fascinated to go into a power station, or, you know, look behind the scenes in a theatre or somewhere where I wouldn't usually go. But what's interesting about this is that actually at some point we all will be involved in that environment because of the inevitability of life and death.
Exactly.
Anyway, let me open it out. Does anyone want to jump in? Jessa with a first question?
Hi, Jessa.
Hi, hello, Yuko. I wanted to ask about I was really struck, because I know you've been making the film for ages. And yet what really struck me was the thing about the cardboard, and then the shot of the cardboard coffin. Now, I don't know, because I don't know the ins and outs of crematoria, but my dad was buried in a cardboard coffin, which we chose. That's what he wanted. But at the end, is it like that everyone gets put into a receptacle like that? Because what I was really struck by was the relationship. At the beginning, you were showing all the boxes, and then at the end, there's somebody in a box. And I wondered if at what point you had realized there was this thing about the cardboard, because there's this extraordinary thing with the cardboard. And I was like, it's the ultimate parcel. Like, it's like end destination. That's it. And I just thought that was extraordinary, the way you'd use the material that had.
It wasn't pre-thought.
Yeah, it's weird, right? I just noticed it with and I was like, it's the parcels all coming in, and then they're all going out, and there's this last parcel. And I just wondered, does everybody get transferred to a cardboard receptacle, or is that something specific that just?
Well, so it's different between countries, because I'm really interested in how, you know, we do things in the United States and how we do things in Britain. I don't think that happens in Britain. I think people choose their coffin. I mean, like you chose a cardboard one.
We had cardboard for my dad, and my mother was in a wicker.
But I think more often you choose that coffin. If you choose the coffin to be wood, then you would burn with wood. So in this case, when people are cremated in the States, they don't purchase a coffin because coffins are expensive. Right? So that's a whole nother market there that funeral costs, you know, bring up. You are put into a cardboard coffin, which you pay for about $30 or $40, I think, or more. And you're brought to the crematorium. A lot, you know, I saw a lot of the things that we shot, you know, people are larger than the coffin box. And in that case, they're brought on a wood, you know, base or something. So not everybody, but yes, most people, the cardboard burns with the body.
It's just an extraordinary link about you being in a receptacle, and it just, the juxtaposition of those things made me kind of like really hyper aware of you, essentially you being. And I thought, what is the final destination? You're talking about the structure of like the postal service, and then you're going off into this collective unconscious.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you wanted to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to talk about there in terms of, you know, aspects of the body as a vessel, and the soul, and how we sort of tap back into the grid, I think. And it's something that completely fascinates me.
Yeah.
I think talking to the workers at the crematorium and talking to my father, you know, they really believe that it's a vessel, you know. Otherwise, I think it would be a different type of work, right? So what's interesting is when I sort of was thinking about this talk and thinking about all the thinking that I do that maybe goes into the work itself, I and the pandemic, cardboard was, I've never really used cardboard before. Of course, I've shot this stuff and I saw a lot of cardboard, but it didn't actually register to me until I saw that article about the stolen cremains. And that's when things started sort of clicking together. But yeah, I mean, I'm still thinking about all this stuff. And I think we could have a Zoom talk just talking about the body and how we, what is it that we leave behind? But
Yeah.
we'll have to do that.
We'll do that.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you. Zara, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Oh, yes, I did. Thank you, Yuko, for the talk. I found it really, really interesting. And basically for a series of work that I've done is called the Veil series. And it all started out me looking into Heidegger, a German philosopher who thought about, he was a Nazi, so pretty terrible on that level. But some of his philosophy was that he believed in living our life authentically, and to live it authentically, you have to understand your own finitude and be aware of the fact that you were going to die. And it really kind of made this catalyst for me. And actually, you just spoke about kind of like the anthropology of different cultures and how they deal with death. And there's a really, really good book that I wanted to recommend you called Death's Summer's Coat.
Okay.
And basically it is a broad, I can't remember, I will find out who it's by and I will message you.
Oh,
yeah, Google it. But the author of that book basically talks about different anthropological studies in different parts of the world, and then brings it back onto the UK, and how that in the medical journal in the UK, when people are kind of like dealing with grief, they have like a set amount of time. I think it's 12 weeks, it may be a bit longer or shorter. And then suddenly it goes from like the death of the grieving, and then if they're still grieving after that certain time period, then it goes to them being depressed, and then they're supplied antidepressants and stuff. But I just thought that it was really interesting, the whole thing basically. And yeah, I was wondering about what made you become like really fascinated by death? Was it the fact that you had a lot of death around you in terms of the coronavirus, or was it something that's fascinated you for a long period of time?
Right. No, it's been a long period of time. I grew up, I grew up with a doctor. My father was a doctor, and he was a pathologist. He diagnosed disease. And but he was also the medical examiner where we lived. So, growing up, any murder, suicide, accidental, car accident, he was always there. And so we would always hear these stories about what went wrong, what went right. And he did, most of the autopsies. He did most of the autopsies. So that was always very present for me as a child. And then when I went to university, he opened a cremation facility. So, I mean, you can't make this stuff up, really. But it had a big impact on me. I think what I learned from that was, we always read the obituaries wherever we lived, and we lived in a lot of different places. And the reason for that was to really get a sense of the community. And I think, when we look at how people die, we really are looking at a direct relationship to the health of those places. And so I think I learned that quite early. Wow. Thanks for coming.
No, right, it was amazing.
Any other questions? Or thoughts, maybe, unresolved thoughts? Sean, first.
Thanks, Yuko. That was a fantastic talk, really fascinating. I know your work and some other work that you've made, and the films that you're making before this are very much about other people, documentaries that you're making, etc. and now you're talking about how since lockdown you're working in a different way, but working in this more personal way, making a film about your dad and then working on personal memories. Was that something you kind of saw coming, or has that kind of crept up on you, this more introspective approach to your work? And or has it always been there, even in your documentary practice about other people? Was any of that kind of autobiographical in a way, maybe projected onto other people? Or
exactly. I think so. I mean, I think that you sort of seek out what you want to see, right? And I think I made a film with my father many years ago, my first film, and it's still showing today. And I actually showed it at UWI. And what struck me about the comments there were that, oh, this relationship with you and your dad is really interesting. And you don't really think about that when you're making work. But so when he told me he was retired, I thought, oh, well, we should end it with a film, right? So in that way, it's sort of two bookends. But in terms of my other work, I think that I'm interested in people that sort of have similar feelings about themselves than me, or are holding something back and are trying to find a way to voice that. Like I think I can see that, or I can feel that. And so those subjects, in a way, are myself in a tiny way. They are autobiographical. It's the things that we have in common, stories that maybe resonate but aren't exactly the same, rooted in place, or the feelings we get from society, and those sort of things are sort of told from a powerfully told from an autobiographical perspective. So possibly, but you could say that for all art, right? But yes, I think the answer is yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone?
What did you guys think of the film? I see that there's people in the chat.
So Vicky, if you're interested in work by the filmmakers that deal with similar subject matter, that'd be great. I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it, how you kind of you talk about the mechanics of death and in part the business of death, and it's a really pragmatic approach to those things. And then your father says, it's not the materiality of life in a way that's important. It's not the physical body, it's the consciousness. And
right.
I'm not quite sure what this thought is that I'm trying to form here, but there's something between that kind of relationship that you weave in between the materiality of this cardboard and these other objects and the body as object, and those kind of universal and community concerns of togetherness and isolation. It's really interesting.
Can I come in here about something? Because it just occurred to me when you were saying that, Jessica, and you're saying I can't quite get the thought. It just occurred to me, it's because that thing about, and relating to you started talking about the protest at the beginning, and just that the body is relational, and that's why when we are in a public space, we are related. It is why we have gone into that space, and it's the body has that materiality in relation to others. And when I think that thing about when you die and the body that is what remains is that thing that goes into the which we've talked about, this collective consciousness that I don't know, I feel like the body is kind of, we're scratching around at the shell of the body as a vessel that is both container and beyond that. It's sort of like two things. It is in itself, and it's a sort of gets in the way of something beyond itself, which is relational. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to me it does.
Who said that? Who, I can't see. Who said that? Put their hand up.
Oh, that was me.
Oh yeah, sorry. I thought it was someone else. Sorry.
It's funny, this idea of the collective consciousness. I mean, maybe somebody else wants to speak to it, but it's something that I'm quite interested. I think as a kid, and it's sort of what I tell my own children. You know, when we go see art, or the masters, or you know, Van Gogh, or whatever, you know, how are they continually relevant past their time, right? As artists. And it's because they left something, you know, documents, letters, paintings, that somebody else in turn picked up and carried them with them, right? So I think a lot of this, I mean, I think it's interesting to sort of discuss, you know, what we leave behind that sort of keeps the, you know, veil of the body in the present. But I don't know what other people think about that.
Sorry, if I could jump in there. That reminds me of I think it was Val Plumwood spoke about shadow places, and how in order to rematerialize ourselves with the world, we need to acknowledge the shadow places that include you know, like warehouses, the factories, and all of the places that are that help us sort of live, but that we kind of ignore sort of in our day-to-day lives. And I was wondering, do you think that places like crematoriums are also shadow places? Because especially in the West, sort of with death comes a kind of a veil, and we tend to sort of leave it to the system. We put people into hospitals or people's homes, and we try and ignore death as much as possible. Mm. So in a way, I think your work almost rematerializes that kind of, or like re-engages with death in a way that doesn't want to ignore it anymore.
Right.
I was wondering, yeah, if you could go discuss that maybe.
I mean, what's really interesting, and I like this idea of shadow places, is that each of the workers, my father included, there talks very deeply about the Native American traditions around death. And they cremate, and they come to the crematorium. And I, unfortunately, in the 15 days that I shot what I shot, I didn't get to experience it, but they were like, you've got to come back, because what you realize is that, you know, these sort of ancient, or these cultures, are very much connected to death. We're just not seeing that, right? So they would bring their dead not in a cardboard box, but perfectly dressed to the nines, jewelry and everything. They would stay with them, and they would be in a circle holding hands, and they do a whole ritual of songs before all the community would push them into the retort. So, you know, we may not be seeing that, right? But it is happening. So I love this notion of shadow places, because it's sort of, you know, you can visualize that, you know, what we would consider dark corners are actually illuminated for other people already. You know, it's us that have to sort of get back there. We've put this taboo on something that is not really taboo. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yuko, I'm just going to ask a question that Anna has put in the chat. She loves the cardboard works and wonders if you're going to carry on with it a bit with it I'm really interested in the temporality of the material and the way it relates to life. It's obvious that I would love the protest signs, I guess, she says.
You know, it's funny. I think it'd be interesting to do like more of a study of the protest signs from the beginning to, I mean, it's not over, right? It's a movement, not a moment. That was one of the signs. To see sort of more what people were holding and fighting for in terms of their slogans, and I think that would be interesting work to sort of maybe delve a little bit into that. I mean, sometimes when we think about protest signs, we're always thinking back to the 60s, you know, Freedom Now and a lot of the stuff that was done in SNCC and stuff in the South. And, in my bigger points of rage, I just want to pull out some of those slogans, but there are so many new ones. So I think it would be interesting to look at that in more of a, I don't know, scientific sort of way. So yeah, I should. Maybe I will if you think it's interesting. Thank you, Anna. Anybody else? I saw Joe. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, you saw. Yes, it kind of went off topic.
Okay.
But it was the film, the dealing with the remains of the cremation that I found quite culture shock, actually. I'd never really thought about it, but I'd always assumed that wherever people went to a crematorium of some kind or another, and it was dealt with not necessarily kind of religiously or anything, but that was so industrial by comparison, and even like using a magnet and a car number plate to it was I wasn't expecting that. It made things that started springing to mind was like, the German concentration camps and searching for gold teeth and all of that. It was a complete. I wasn't expecting that at all.
Sure, right. I think what's interesting for me in finding more about the ins and outs of the crematorium is how our bodies, I mean, what's interesting about the magnet, right, is that we're doing so much to our bodies in terms of surgery, knee replacements, hip replacements. We have heart monitors and all these things that when we're alive, our body takes over those things and they become sort of one with you, right? And when you come to the crematorium, all those things need to be removed. You can't.
Well, do they?
Huh?
Do they, or is it merely commercial?
Well.
Can't they be left?
They can't be left. They have to be taken out because, say, the retort itself, a heart monitor would explode, right? So a lot of the metal, especially all the metal that we have in our bodies, has to be removed for the bones to be ground. You can't ground those things. So they're removing them to continue with the process. And I think it is interesting. I think it's a lot of things that I didn't expect and I hadn't seen before either. But I initially, I think, thought, and I knew that I was wrong, but that the body broke down so much that it was already ash. And logically that can't be true. And I didn't bring the clip of showing the grinding, but it's it's, yeah, something to behold, I guess.
It was.
Right. For all of us, Joe. Thank you for commenting.
Okay. Well, thank you anyway.
Yeah.
We've got some comments in the chat, Yuko, if you want to look over those, but I think if nobody else has any other questions, no, we will leave it there and say thank you very much, Yuko. It was really fascinating to hear more about your work, and look forward to seeing more of it hopefully next year. Have you got,
Yeah,
to show that?
Screen the short or something.
Yeah.
After this COVID period's over, of course.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And we have one last talk next week, which is with Alice Shepherd Fiddler. And that will be at 1 o'clock again. And that's our last talk this year before the Christmas break. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.